So I sent my disc that contains this safer off to be upgraded, and there's a guy in Hamilton that upgrades it, so it's on its way back. So I figured that instead of doing a piece, we I don't have the next part, so let's do a piece from Rav Nathanson from the early 19th century, where he talks about this idea of Baltolin, some of the details of the prohibition of Baltolin. Okay, so here, I'll share my screen. Yeah. So the Torah says lo talin. Lo talin pulat sachir itcha ad boker. You may not delay the payment of a worker until morning. So that's literally, so the word Baal is the Aramaic. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yes. There are two prohibitions in the Torah called Baal Talim. There are two separate prohibitions that have nothing to do with each other. There's a prohibition called Lina in the Torah, which has to do with korbanos. Lina is when you leave over a korban and don't eat the sacrificial meat. So if you leave it overnight, it's not kosher. It's delayed, right?
So it's similar, I guess.
It is similar, yeah. Okay. Lalun is to sleep or to lodge, yeah. Right, because basically it implies that you're delaying your journey so that you can you can rest, yeah. Okay, so the inyan bal talin imahani tanai va'od pratim bazeh. So this tshuva does a making a tanai, which is really the question that we were dealing with in the last several days. Can I stipulate a condition with the employee? Oops, it's behaving strange. Can I stipulate a condition with the employee not to pay him on time? Nistapakti im yachola hatnot al menat shelo ya'avor beval talin. He says, I'm not sure whether you can do that. Umekor hasafek, so the source of my doubt is da'af bedavar shebibamon de tanai kayam mikol makom. He says, even in financial dealings, we do know that sometimes if you make a stipulation with another consenting party, you can negotiate whatever you want, right? The classic case is ona'ah, right? But there are, which is like ripping someone off. You're not allowed to overcharge by 1/6 of the fair market value. But what if you tell the guy, hey, I'm charging you an arm and a leg, and you're not getting any bargains. Are you still willing to pay my price? So Mikol Makom Ha'amru B'Bava Metzia Daf Nun Aleph Amid Beis Umakos Daf Gimel She'ein Ba'al Menas She'ein Lecha Alai Ona'a Ein Lo Alav Ona'a. The Gemara makes a distinction in what language you use. If you say to a person, I hereby will sell you this item on the condition that you have no claim of ona'ah against me, then that's a valid condition in the transaction. But almanas she'ein bo ona'ah, harei yesh bo ona'ah. But if you say that there's no ona'ah on the condition that there's no ona'ah here, then you are in violation because you're being matna al masha kasav b'Torah. You're stipulating directly against something that's written in the Torah. It really all boils down to what kind of condition you make. If the condition is, I'll sell you the item, even though I'm overcharging you on the condition that you don't sue me or demand or try to void the transaction, then I'll sell it to you. But if you say on the condition that there's no ona'ah here, that there's bichlal no prohibition of ona'ah, so then that's not a valid stipulation because the Torah says there is ona'ah. V'chein b'makos daf gimel le'inyan shvius. In the same thing, let's say I make a loan with you, I lend you money, and I say on the condition that Shemitah will not cancel the loan, because we know that Shemitah cancels the loan. So you can't say, I'll lend you the money on the condition that Shemitah doesn't cancel the loan. That's absurd. Shemitah, right. But if I say on the condition that you'll still pay me back after Shemitah, then that's a valid negotiation. V'hainu mishum dahavale matne al masha kasuv b'Torah. V'hainu mishum di'ef shelo lahatnot al divrei Torah. He says you can't negotiate against the Torah's principles. Da al kain huchal, hu adin bazeh, da al kor chachal. He says whether you like it or not, there's an obligation to pay an employee immediately upon rendering of services. And so how can you say that I'm on the condition that I don't have to pay you? Ba'ayin betos v'sham u'v'tur shulchan aruch Choshen Mishpat, etc. Ach nira dibazeh lo shayach zos. He says, however, my feeling is that it doesn't matter how you negotiate it. Because when we think about what the basis of the requirement to pay someone immediately after service is rendered, this you will see that this case is different. Da al karchach lo amrinan zos rak gabe shmita, da ona or ve'ona. He says we only say this in cases of shmita and ona. Da haTorah lo hikpida al hana'aso shel zeh. Where the Torah there doesn't, when the Torah says you cannot overcharge someone, you cannot demand payment of a loan if Shemitah interrupted the loan cycle. He says there it's not dependent upon the exploitation of another person or the other person being disappointed and so forth, the feelings of the other party. Rak sharatzisa shelo yihye bo ona. There, the Torah says, that God says, I don't want there to be ona'ah, regardless of how the other person feels. V'ha'isr al hamocher v'al halokeach, rak she'im ratza limchol mochel. And therefore, there's a biblical prohibition upon the buyer and the seller. Don't rip someone off, right? And if you do, you're in violation. Now, can I rip someone off if he's moichel? Sure. There, Hashem says it's perfectly fine. V'chein b'shmita. And the same thing, says Hashem, loans are canceled with shmita. If a guy wants to pay you anyway, no problem. Imkein shapir amrinan dehich matna almas shelo haya yiya bo ona'a hamikol makom me'anehu ve'alkein havalei be'isr. He says, and therefore, when you don't negotiate the terms correctly using the right language, like you say, on the condition that there's no ona'ah, well, there is ona'ah, and therefore you're still in violation. Avalkan ikar ha'isr hu mishum ke'elav hu noseyet nafsho. But now let's take a look by contrast, the pasuk of you must pay the worker on time. What is the reason the Torah gives for having to pay your worker on time? Because he is placing his soul in the hands of that wage. In other words, he's depending upon that wage for his livelihood. V'imkein kol shemasna imo shelo yihya baltalin v'lo nichnas adaita dahachi sheyakabel hamos tekev. So because the Torah places the dependency of this prohibition on the feelings of the worker, and as long as you disclose to the worker that you won't be able to pay him on the same day that he renders services, so he won't have those bad feelings, he won't have that tremendous disappointment, in Kain shuv lo shayach iser baltalin. And therefore, you're no longer incurring the violation of baltalin by not paying him, because you've already dispelled his anticipation. So when the Torah places the prohibition on the feelings of the other party, if you disclose to the other party, I'm not going to be, I want you to, I got a plumber coming today. I want you to fix my my clog sink, but I'm not going to be able to pay you right away. Are you still willing to come over? And the guy says, yeah, I'm happy to come over. I don't need the money anyway until the end of the month. I'm fine. Don't worry about it. So then there's no baltalin because I'm not doing what the Torah says I can't do, which is failing to give a person what he's depending upon. Okay, that's essentially what the way he's learning it. V'lo gara mehadim avur b'shulchan aruch sham siftes b'sachir shemakir b'balabayas she'eno maskiro rak liyom hashuk. He says it's the same thing if, let's say, a worker knows that the balabayas only hires him during marketplace days. And therefore, if he comes to work for him on any other day, he knows that the employer is not going to have the money. And that's permissible, the Shulchan Aruch had said. De'ena over. Uma kol shekain bazeh de'ikar hakpada bishvil hasachir v'hu mochal v'nityayish mazeh v'zeh barur ma'od. And he says, and it's pretty clear over here. Since you've stipulated it, the employee is totally moichel. He's not hoping to get the wage on that day, and therefore it's no problem. Uvazen nirali dehu hadin pepoil shematna shelo yochel min hadayish demoil. He says, in a similar vein, we know that when you have a worker working out in the field, he's allowed to eat from the produce over the course of the harvest period. That's one of the requirements. The Torah says you have to allow your workers to nibble on the produce that they are working with. The guy's out in an orchard picking oranges. He's permitted to eat oranges in the course of picking the oranges, so or wheat or whatever it is. But let's say the employer makes it a condition of the work contract, no eating. You know, I want this harvest to go exclusively to my silo. The gambazeh af shematna al mashalo yehebo din chasama demuter. He says, as long as you negotiate that in advance, it's permissible. That's a legally binding contract. He says, the ikerhu bishvil hapoel v'ha atzni imo shelo ya'avor v'zeh barur. He says, and therefore in that case also, where you're negotiating that the worker is willing to forego that, since the Torah made this whole accommodation for the sake of the worker, and he's willing to accept the work condition that he doesn't need to eat while he's out in the field. He doesn't like oranges and it doesn't care, and he's going to bring his own lunch or whatever it is, and he's totally fine. So then you're allowed to negotiate that. Ba'ayin simin shin lamed zayin sif yud zayin uvazen nirali di maskir behema umatna aleha shelo tochal. He says, but he says, based on that, it would seem to me that if you rent an animal, and we know the Torah says lo sachsom shor bedisha, you're not allowed to muzzle an animal because you're causing it pain, because it's in the middle of work in the field pulling the plow and it wants to nibble on grain. He says that you're not allowed to negotiate. The kifi hanira eino rashai, kamo de eino rashai lahatnot albanov uvnotov haketanim. So like, it's no different, for example, if let's say I negotiate with a worker on the condition that you don't eat the oranges while you're picking them, but I can't negotiate for the sake of your minor children. Let's say I've got a migrant family and they're working for me and the whole family is picking oranges. So the guy himself can say, I'm going to forego on eating oranges, but I can't negotiate on behalf of my little kids because they're going to be they're going to suffer and they don't understand. I can't negotiate on their behalf. They don't have enough das, kimavur, etc. V'hu adin al habehema, and the same thing would therefore be true for an animal. So I can negotiate on my own behalf to deprive myself certain workers' benefits, but I can't negotiate on behalf of someone who doesn't have das, who doesn't have proper cognition. Achi shlomer detoli beplugta itzar balechayim de oraisa. He says, but we could argue there is tsar balechayim, the prohibition of inflicting pain on creatures, on animals, is that a biblical prohibition? The imlo havarak de rabbanon b'derabbanon teno kayim, de lo adif mitzar mamish. He says there is an opinion that says that it's only a rabbinic law, and therefore, if one of the stipulations is that I will hire your animal on the condition that I'm allowed to inflict pain on it, that may be a bad thing. It may be a sign of poor moral character, but it would be a binding condition in the course of a work contract. Because if a person makes a stipulation that only violates a rabbinic law, even though what he's doing is usher, nevertheless, the contract is still binding. He said, it is, but it's a machlokas whether it's deoraisa or derabana. So I didn't remember that this is a machlokas. Uladidan de kaimelan shehu min haTorah, but we paskin that it's deoraisa. Im kain eno rashai lahatnot kain nira lefi anias daiti. He says, but we paskin that it's deoraisa, tsar balechayim, and therefore you're not allowed to negotiate on behalf of a dumb animal that it's not going to eat while it's working out in the field. So he says, Shuv ra'isi b'shach, shehevi b'shem sefer chasidim, shekasav she'im hiskir poel matne al menas shalotia beval tolin ve'ein bazem mishum masnal mashakasav b'torah. He says, I also noticed the Shach says the same idea, quoting from the Sefer Chasidim, that if you hire a worker and you negotiate in advance that you don't have to pay him on that same day, then there's no problem of negotiating against the Torah. Shaharei amru chachamim adam matne im hapoel lechol lechem tsar ad kam l'shono. And we saw this quoted from Rav Shraga, that a person is allowed to negotiate with a worker that I'm only going to feed you dark bread, just cheap bread, instead of giving you the meal of King Solomon for your lunch. Udavarav lichora temuhim. He says, and it would seem very strange, the analogy that the Shach is making. The pshita, the bedavar shebimamon tenokayim, v'lo hayatzarech lahavi mir merchak. He says, isn't that obvious that when it comes to negotiating how much you're going to pay somebody, that you're allowed to make such a condition? So why does he bring this remote analogy? Ulafima shekosafti kavanaso af shehitna almanas shalotia bevaltolin dezeino moel v'kan moel de'ein hakpada rak al hasachir v'yacholimcho l'chamosham v'doik. He says the analogy is that it all has to do with the feelings and the sensitivities of the worker. And as long as, even though the worker is entitled to demand a very lavish lunch, but as long as you negotiate with him in advance, you're okay. And the same thing would be true over here. Umin ha'amor, based on what I've said, nir lefi anias daiti, the divrei hamagen Avram temuhin. He says the Magen Avram in Siman Kuf Samech Tes is very strange. The be'inyan hamaychol eno yachol lahasnos, ulefi ma shekosafti hadavar pasha demoel, uchamo demuter lahasnos im hapoyalim al sudasam, bekein halasoicher bevaltolin, devada ikatzar ki elavu noseas nafsho, bekein halapoyal be'is hadayish bevada yesh sartfei v'dok. He says, I don't understand why the Magen Avram says in Siman Kuf Samech Tes that a Tanai doesn't help. Now, what is the case over there? That's the only thing I don't know. It must be talking about a situation. Okay. I'm not going to expand on this because it would take us time. We would have to look up the case that the Magen Avram is referring to. So I think we'll skip. Let's go on to the next point that he makes. B'hinei ba'inan bal tolin, or be'inyan, that's probably a typo. Bal tolin ra'isi davar nifla shelo urar bazeh shum acharon. He says, I want to continue on this topic of bal talin and raise an issue that I have not seen any other acharon discuss. B'hinei betur b'shulchan aruch Choshen Mishpat simin shin lametes muvur da al sachar karka eno over al bal talin. He says the Tur quotes the Ramah that we learned yesterday and the day before, that when you rent real estate, you're not over on Bal Tolin. If you're late on the rent, there's no prohibition of Bal Tolin. Because of Habach, the Lamad Kain, Mida Amru Bibava Metzia Daf Kuf Yiraleh. Ainli Elischar Adam, Minayin Larabos Sochar Behema Vekalim. He says the only time we see that there's a prohibition of Baltolin is when you hire a human being to work for you. What if you hire an animal, or what if you rent appliances? Tamulomar kol asher ba'artzacha. So the Torah says anything that's in your land. Umidalo amr minayin l'rabo sachar karka shmamina dedarshinan kol asher ba'artzacha dahainu davar hamitaltel b'toch artzacha. So the fact that the Gemara doesn't give an example of real estate implies that it's only animals and appliances, but because they are bi'artzecha, they're on your land, but not the land itself. Avalo gufa aretz the sachar karka eno oiver ayin sham. So that's the opinion. We saw that one opinion, and we saw that there's a machlokes as to whether we paskin that way or not. And so remember, Rav Sharaga had said that since it's a suffix on a din de oraisa, you should be machmir and always pay your rent on time, lest you come to the prohibition of bal talin. V'hinei batchila haya tamua be'enan, the harama yidrosh droshos me'atzmo. So the first problem I have is that since when does a Rishon get to make his own biblical exegetical derivation, right? How do you make your own drasha? Only Chazal can do that. Shezelo yitachen elolabale hashas. Only someone in the Gemara itself has a right to do that. Veraisi b'shita mikubetzes shehevi b'shem harosh. Shechasa shedishtaner taimei deharama delomar binan ela behema v'kelim shaosim bahem malacha dumya desachir ayin sham. So the Shita Mikubetzes offers a logical argument to support the Ramah. The Torah says only when you're hiring someone to do work for you. So animals do work for you. Appliances do work for you, like the plow tills the soil. That's work for you. A human being does work for you. But real estate does not do work for you. Real estate is worked upon. Okay? Omnam b'sefer das zekenu matzasi v'huma rabosenu balei atois v'zal shekasvu b'parshas kedoshim al velo talin b'zeh halasha. However, I noticed that one of the Tosafists, the Das Zekenim, brings a drasha from Toras Kohanim, which is a halachic midrash. It's the Sifra. Ainli ela sochar adam, sochar behema v'sochar karkaos minayin. How do we know that even if you rent real estate, not just animals, but even real estate, that you're in violation? Talmulomar velo talin pulat sachir. Are kol davar b'mashma mikan yishlimo dahasocher bayit o behema lechavero umasha escharo she'over olav mishum bal talin v'talmid shalanu eno mazkir karkos klal adkan l'shana. So the Das Zekenim brings this midrash, which makes a point of saying that if you are late on paying your rent, you're in violation of Bal Talin, contrary to our own Gemara. So it seems like, based on this, that there's a machlokas between the Bavli and the Sifra. You know, you have two sources in the Talmudic literature. One says specifically animals, human beings, and appliances. The other one includes even real estate. So you have to know, how do we go? V'hinei mevuar shegam karkos oiver v'hu tema acharei shebetoras kohanim mefurish ki kain eich darash harama drashos midaite denapshe. So now we've only got a greater question on the Rama. Where does he get off to make this drasha that real estate is excluded if the Sifra says explicitly that real estate is included? Umash shelo matzinu zecher klal b'shas af shelo hizchiro avol mikol makom mehecha tesi shiachloku ala Toras Kohanim. He says, I will grant you. The Gemara omits any mention of real estate, but omission is not proof, right? So where does the Rama have the ability to derive this and say that there's a machlokes between the Bavli and the Sifra? Uve'emes shegam b'shas dilan darshu mipulat sachir itecha v'imkein af karka b'mashma. He says, and the truth is, what is the basis of the drasha of the Gemara, including animals and appliances? Because the word itecha is superfluous. So it says everything that is itecha, everything that is with you that you need to work with. So therefore, logically, you could include real estate. V'gam mashakasav harash dumya disachir adam. Hine milvad lo yadati gam b'schir adam shelo ya'avor al karkos shim osa melacha bebayis v'harei ba'osa melacha basada over al baltolin. He says, and similarly, the Rush says that dumya disachir adam. He says that apparently the Rush wants to make a distinction between whether you hire someone to work in your field or you hire someone like a plumber to work in your house. In both cases, you would think that the person is over on Baltolin. V'harei amru balabayas torud b'poyalav v'amru sham delo yavor al Baltolin mashma b'meleches asada de balabayas imapoylim b'meleches asada mashma v'hu adin b'soicher bayas v'karka afgam de al kolpanim mipulat sachir itacha meharoi de yavor b'tzorach iyun gadol. So let's see. Okay. I think what he's referring to is that there's a drasha that the Gemara makes that it's only when the worker is with you that you're in violation of Baal Tolim. Just give me 1 second, and I'll show this to you. I know that there's a drasha of itecha that he has to be with you in order for you to be in violation. I just don't remember now. Let's see, Pulat Sachir. Okay, and what does the Torah Tanima say? There we go. Itecha. Echad sochar adam, ve'echad sochar behema, ve'echad sochar kelim, yesh bo mishum lo talin pulat sachir. The Amar Kra lo talin pulat sachir itecha, kol shepu'ulato itecha. Any time where the work is being done together with you, okay, fine. We also learn from the word itecha, yachal afilu lo tavo tamalomar itcha l'daitcha. That's only when he asks you for the money. That's what we learned from itecha, meaning that it has to be that you have denied him because he's with you in the same attitude of wanting to get paid. Yachal afilu ein lo tamalomar itcha sheyesh itcha. Yachal afilu himcheyu eitzel chen b'ni ve'etzel shulchani Tamulomar itecha, that in a situation where you have sent him to work, but you're not there present, you're not there, so then you're also not in violation. Let's see. So what is Rav Nathanson getting at from this? From that, he says, from the word itecha, he says. So anyway, bottom line is that we are left with this big kasha on why you shouldn't be liable to pay the rent on time. Because real estate ought to be included. And that was Rav Sharaga's conclusion as well, that in a situation where we're dealing with a suffix deoraisa, you certainly should be machmir. So we'll hold it here for today. Sorry, I don't have the text, but Ezra Hashem, I'll get it later today in the mail. And hopefully we'll have some more